Life Management Science Labs would like to acknowledge that we live and produce this podcast on the traditional lands of the Wurundjeri people. We'd also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands of our listeners and our international colleagues. We'd like to pay our respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. Hello everyone, and welcome to Bouncing Back, the Personal Resilience Science Insights podcast produced by LMSL, the Life Management Science Labs. We are champions of life management science, providing structured insights informed by science and inspired by practice on key aspects of conscious living. Each week, we bring you scientific and practical insights on each element with the expert knowledge of professionals in the field. I am your host, Joanna. Let's get started. Hi guys, and welcome back to Bouncing Back, our personal resilience podcast. I'm your host, Joanna, and today we're going to be talking about something that I'm super excited to talk about because I feel like we just don't have enough conversations surrounding this. So I'll be joined by Georgie Cameron to talk about the healing and self-care post-trauma. So we're going to dive right into this topic, but before that, I'd love to introduce Georgie. So she is a strength-based educational and development psychologist who loves to help people of all ages, including helping people find solutions to life challenges. Hi, Georgie. How are you today?
Hi, Joanna. I'm good. How are you?
I'm great. Thank you so much for being here with us.
Great. No, it's a pleasure to be. I'm excited about the conversation we're having today.
Yeah, and we're excited to have you here. Before we get started, would you like to just introduce a bit more about yourself and what it is you do?
Yeah, so I guess as you said, I'm an educational and developmental psychologist, which I suppose is a little bit different to some, a clinical or a counselling, in that we have very much a framework of development and lifespan development and understanding people within a system. And often our experience is working in schools and with younger people, children and adolescents, and that's been predominantly my experience working in schools. As a psychologist, but also as a trainer in positive education and kind of whole school approaches. And also, I guess there's a big part of what I do is research as well. So I'm a practitioner as well as a researcher, and the area of research I'm most interested in at the moment is trauma-informed practices. So this is why it's a really good opportunity to have a chat, I guess, about where practice and research kind of aligns for me anyway.
Yeah, for sure. And could you tell us a bit more about what strength-based educational and development psychology is?
So I suppose strength-based, I guess it's just kind of combining two things in that educational psychology, as I said, is one kind of area, and I like to kind of describe myself as strength-based because that's how I practice. I start with the people's strengths and find out about who they are, what they value, what's important to them, what makes life meaningful for them, and then we focus on the problem. So even when I'm working with a client in session, I'll say, look, I know that you've probably come here to see me for problems, but I want to get to know you first outside the problem, because sometimes problems can overwhelm and I guess diminish the person and who they are. So I really start from strengths and then build from there. And I try and do that in organizations as well as in individuals.
Yeah, amazing. And what made you want to get into this line of work?
I think I've just kind of fallen into it, I never kind of set out to be strength-based, and even an educational psychologist, even a psychologist I kind of fell into. I really like working with people, and then as I was working as a psychologist and training to be a psychologist, I kind of came across strength-based approaches and how people were, when you talk in a clinical setting and you say, how are you approaching this client? And some people use that terminology, and I thought that's interesting. And it's interesting because it also coincided with a time where psychology was shifting a lot as well. So so when I was training, around that time, positive psychology was just starting to really take off. So it kind of coincided my training time, and as I was developing into a psychologist, positive psychology was developing as well. So I kind of caught the bug of that and got really interested in positive psychology, and positive psychology is this, I guess, this swing that happened in around 2000 that psychologists that Martin Seligman was the head of the APA at the time, which is the American Psychological Association, and he kind of, put out there that we really need to start focusing on the positive aspects of life as psychologists, and we're missing people's character strengths, we're missing all of these things because we're kind of getting stuck in the diagnoses, and it kind of spurned this whole huge raft of research around character strengths, around mindfulness, around gratitude, around things that are important in people's lives. And so I think I ended up working at Geelong Grammar School, which is a kind of leader in positive education. It was one of the first schools in the world to implement positive education, and Martin Seligman came and stayed there, and so it was a great environment to be part of and to learn how to implement something across a whole culture. So yeah, that's how I kind of got into it.
Yeah, that's such an amazing journey, and I'd love to get to know you a bit more. So we're gonna go into our section we like to call "Have You Met Georgie?" So I'll just ask you. Yeah, it is a bit fun. So I'll just say a couple different topics, and you can just say the first thing that pops into your mind when I say these words. So my first one for you is books.
Books. I read a lot, but I feel like I'm not sure if I'm product of our time at the moment, but I am a perennial dipper of different books. I always have about 20 on the go at any given time. And I read a lot for purpose. So I tend to read a lot of therapy books. So if I'm seeing clients, I might get stuck and think, because I'm quite an integrative therapist as well. I use lots of different approaches, and I might be thinking, what else could I do here that might be beneficial, and so then I'll end up going on Kindle and buying too many books. And so I've got lots of books, lots of unfinished books, but I tend to read what I need from a book. So that's kind of what kind of comes up for books when you say books.
Yeah, awesome. I love that. I'm very similar in that aspect. I feel like I've always got not 20, but probably 5 books that I read a little bit of them here and there, and I'm just trying to get through all of them because I'm just so keen to read every single one of them.
Well, everything's so interesting. It's hard to and there's always so much to learn, and so different days you want to learn different things.
Yeah, for sure. No, I'm 100% the exact same way. My next one for you is movies. Do you have a favorite movie?
Oh, I'm a mum of 3 kids, and my partner and I don't get a lot of time to sit and watch movies. So we tend to do Netflix series instead. So because an hour is about as much as we can do at night. So we tend to watch a lot of Netflix series, what are we watching at the moment? Watching Heels, Yellowstone. Yeah, really kind of drama-filled ones, I have to say. But also we also like comedies and things.
Yeah, beautiful. My next one for you is podcasts.
I love podcasts. Yeah. Just I could eat them up. I just love listening to conversations, and love particularly psychologists. There's some shrink wrap radio. As a great one that I've always really enjoyed listening to. It's not just psychologists, it's lots of therapists, and I really like that one. And I just really like conversation, I suppose, as something to listen on and learn from. Yeah.
Has this been something new you've gotten into, or has podcasts just been something you've been into for a while now?
Well, it actually came about when I had to, because where I live, I had to travel when I was working at Geelong Grammar. I wasn't living close to there, and I kind of was thinking about how to make use of the drive, and podcasts was kind of just coming in then, and I started going, okay, these are free. I could listen to them, and oh wow, it's amazing how much you can learn. And it was just, I always just found it a great way of, and for my line of work as well, being in research and training and wanting to find out, I guess, current thinking and topics, it's always been a really, it's really appealed.
Yeah, for sure. And my next one for you is famous role model. Now, when I ask people these questions, sometimes they're like, oh, famous role model, I can't pick one. So you can pick like anyone from your life even that's been an inspiration to you.
I think probably my grandmother. Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
I know that's just probably really cheesy.
No.
But I think, yeah, I think she used to tell a lot of stories and was a really great kind of historian in that way and helped me understand a lot about, I guess, World War II and the impact it had on Australia at the time, on her life, on my family's life generally. So I think she's always been someone that I looked up to. She's passed away a long time ago now, but yeah, just someone that, you know, really led with her heart. And yeah.
That's so beautiful. Thank you for sharing that with us.
That's okay.
And lastly, I'd like to ask if there's like a course you've completed that's been influential to you.
Probably my what's it called? Postgraduate certificate of narrative therapy. Yeah. So I'll probably be even referencing some of that today. I think it's really kind of got into a little bit of as I said, I'm an integrative therapist. I use lots of different therapies, but narrative therapy in particular is something that's really resonated with me, and I always kind of come back to it in some way.
Yeah.
Yeah.
If you don't mind, like, explaining to us what that type of therapy is.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, so it's started by Michael White and David Epstein, and they and a bunch of other people, but I guess they were the main leaders in it. And it was in the 80s and early 90s, though. Kind of came from the family therapy field, and that Michael White's an Australian and David Epstein, I think he's American. Anyway, they collaborated on a bunch of different books that they were both clinicians and they were working in different spaces with families, and they both agreed on, I guess, a particular approach to working with families, which understands the problem. They call it the problem is the problem. So not trying to make the person the problem. So it's specifically non-blaming. So it really, instead of, you know, because I think clinical language can be really blaming sometimes. You know, you have depression, you are depression, you are, you know, the way in which we frame things can mean that people kind of, you know, blame themselves for their issues, and often their issues are contextually based. So the famous example that Michael White used and was this one of, and I guess it's quite familiar to a lot of the narrative therapy community, would be the one of encopresis. So I'm not sure if you've ever heard of encopresis, but that's when children have soiling issues. So they you know, have problems with going to the toilet and that kind of thing. And it can be a really hard thing for a family because, as you can imagine, you're cleaning up a lot and there's a lot of shame attached to it for the child, and they feel a lot of blame and there's a lot of frustration within the family. So instead of, you know, focusing on and saying to the child, you know, why are you doing this? What's happening? You know, what, you know, rewarding it or not, the child, and rewarding them or punishing them or that kind of thing. Not that psychologists often punish, but I guess it was a different approach in helping the child understand the problem's not them, because children often internalize problems. So because they are egocentric and in a way that's just their development. When they're young, they kind of, if something's going wrong, they think it's their fault. So in this way, so with encopresis, Michael White and David Epstein, they talked about, they called it sneaky poo. And so the child understood it as sneaky poo, and when's sneaky poo around, and how do we know when sneaky poo is coming? Instead of kind of putting it in clinical language that the child maybe doesn't relate to or doesn't really understand or internalizes as the issue. So it's really non-blaming, and then the aim of it is to find alternative stories, because as I said before, the problem story can kind of overtake a whole family, and all they think about is that problem and it's kind of hiding all the great things about them, all the strengths and all the beautiful stories about them as a family and as that individual that has that problem.
Yeah, and is this like related to like the positive sort of therapeutic approaches you were talking about before?
Yeah, it's very much aligned to a positive approach because you are kind of trying to carve out, I guess, positive stories in the sense of, I don't like to use positive and negative because I kind of feel like that sometimes, people kind of view that as like one's better than the other. But I guess it's trying to find stories of meaning, stories of hope, stories of their values, of what's important to them, and then what we do is we call it thickening the story. So you try and get more of that story so that it strengthens that identity, it strengthens themselves to then confront the problem.
Yeah, beautiful. And with these types of approaches, do like all the therapeutic approaches you work with, are they like based on like the positive sort of, approach?
Yeah, pretty much. Like I kind of work within a frame of like let's look at the strengths and let's look at building strengths in order to support them to have enough strength to then tackle the problem.
Yeah.
Because I think it also builds that creative sense. So when you're in the problem, our emotions are really they become really tunnel vision. They become really rigid. I mean, our thinking becomes really rigid. We can't see out of it. So sometimes you do need to build up. And then your creative juices kind of get flowing because you kind of realize like there's more opportunity, there's more hope, there's more things that can happen. So that's why I think from a scientific point of view, it's also a really good approach.
Yeah, lovely. Well, I'd love to get into our interview questions and we can unpack more of like the therapeutic approaches you use as well. But let's start off with talking about resilience. I'd love to ask you why you think it's important in our lives.
Look, I've always been really interested in resilience. From, as I said, I've always come up from a strength base. So resilience is kind of bread and butter of strength-based approaches. I think why resilience has interested me is from both a research and a practitioner point of view. So when I first started working in schools, resilience was actually a really big buzz term at the time. Had lots of resilience programs and that kind of thing. It's kind of schools and education goes through different waves, and at the moment it seems much more around self-regulation, but it's kind of doing the same thing, but they call it different things. But resilience was a really big buzzword, and one of the things that I noticed when I was working as a school psychologist was the way in which people talked about resilience didn't kind of sit right for me. They'd say, this child's, getting really emotional in class. They're just not resilient enough. They're not doing resilience right, kind of thing. Not that they said they're not doing resilience right, but that was the implication that they haven't got enough resilience. They need more. We need to kind of give them resilience somehow, give them more skills or strengths or that kind of thing to deal with things. And whilst I agree to some extent that you can definitely change resilience and you can increase resilience and you can build strengths and stuff, I think one of the things that sometimes misses is understanding the whole context, that resilience doesn't happen out of context. That when we look back at the research that started resilience, which was, Emmy Werner's research and others, they were really looking at the longitudinal data and looking at following this big study in Kauai, I think that's how you pronounce it. It's like a Hawaiian island. And they looked at all the risk factors. They looked at following these kids from, young age to older age. And they looked at kids who had lots of risk factors, and some of them had, family dysfunction. Some of them had, abusive, environments that they were living in, or had, were experiencing significant poverty. And what they found when they followed them over time was that 2/3 of them went on to have significant issues. So that might be mental health problems, might be like, life functioning problems, that kind of thing. But what they were interested in, and what I kind of commend them as researchers for noticing, was that, 1/3 of them didn't have that. They went on to have, despite all these major risk factors. They went on to have, they were well functioning at 18, 19 years old. They were going okay, despite having about like 4 or 5 of these risk factors. And so they were really interested in these kids that had kind of had some significant adversity in their lives, but had been able to kind of go back into a resilient pathway.
Yeah.
And I think I think I'm really interested in that research, because it kind of when you dig into that research a bit, it's not just about the skills that they had or them being superhumans. Often it's about the relationships they had. That they had one person that was really special to them in their life, that looked out for them, that cared for them, that made them feel a sense of belonging. So it's not just about the individual. It's always happening in context. And communities make resilience. Individuals make resilience. Families make resilience. They're all part of it. And that's kind of why when I talk about resilience with people, I often favour more kind of nature type of metaphors to really describe that. Resilience is we're like plants in the sense of that, we are all going to face adversities. We're all going to have the storms of life that we can't control. There is no way that anyone can escape this life without some adversity. And I guess that's why resilience is so important. But like plants, that we have this way of surviving and a way of kind of coming back. And it's not always bouncing back. It's sometimes stopping, and sometimes things are happening underneath that we don't see, and sometimes we crawl back, and sometimes we go sideways like a plant does, like we find sun somewhere else. So yeah, I think I really favour that kind of way of thinking of resilience.
Yeah, amazing. And do you think that being resilient means you're not like adverse to stresses and adversity in your life, that you still, despite maybe identifying with being resilient, that you still are just as affected by the challenges that come into your life?
100%. Yeah, I think it's not like, I think a lot of people that process it at the time probably do better over in the long run, being able to kind of cry when you need to cry and feel those emotions when you need to feel those emotions. I don't believe that anyone's immune, I guess, to adversity, that we're all going to feel it in some ways, and that it's this because of that, because it's so common that we have these experiences, we all do resilience differently. So it's like falling in love. Like no person falls in love in the same way. We all kind of cope in different ways, and we get through in different ways, and there's no one way.
Yeah, I think that's a really great way of putting it. And I feel like when we think of resilience, sometimes we think of it as this like one thing, like I'm resilient, therefore I can get through like anything that life throws at me. But I feel like everyone's got so many different life experiences and different things that have happened to them, so they'll see resilience in a different way.
Yeah, for sure. I think that's I think it's really important that people understand that from the outset, that because I think there's sometimes if it's not normalized, then people can feel like, I'm doing resilience wrong. I'm not being resilient enough. I'm not coping when I should be coping, when really they're doing all the things that they need to do. They're sometimes when we have experienced something really hard, we need to have time to process, and we will have those symptoms of, that kind of trauma symptoms, I guess, that sometimes happen. And trauma's got a wider definition these days in terms of what it is. It used to kind of just be kind of thought of as a life-threatening situation, but now it's really about how, when we perceive that our safety is in major threat, and that can affect us from a biological, physiological, psychological, spiritual way. So it's a really broad definition of trauma. I can't remember where I was going with that.
No, that's okay. I think what you were talking about is so important, because I feel like we put a lot of pressure on ourselves sometimes to be super resilient and bounce back don't mind the pun there, I guess. When, we go through something and like we have this visual of like how we should sort of recover from it. And if we don't meet that, then we're really hard on ourselves, because I feel like there is this idealized like idea of what resilience is. So I think it's important not to set like, rigid standards for what that is.
Yeah, and I think that's where it comes down to, again, finding a thicker, like understanding that there's many stories in every situation. So there's multiple stories that we can take from any situation. And one of those stories that can happen from when you have an adversity is that I'm broken, I'm not good enough. And that's one of those, what we'd call like a thin description, if we're talking about narrative therapy, of coming to an identity conclusion, saying something about ourselves and saying, this is who I am based on this one event. When a thicker description might be to understand it, understand all the responses that we did. So, maybe it's easier if I give you an example. Like, for example, mornings are usually stressful for me, and I'm going to use the stress as an example rather than a trauma, but it's still kind of meaning the same, I guess, thing. That the morning's stressful, and I've got 3 kids, so I have to get them to school, and we're always late, and I can tell a story about how I feel really hopeless as a parent, and I feel really like I'm not good enough as a parent because I'm always kind of getting nagging at them, and we're always running late, and that kind of thing. And that's one story I can tell. But I can similarly, the same situation, I can also tell a story of like, we've got it down to a pretty good system now. We do breakfast, get dressed, toilet, out the door. And I can appreciate that I actually can take my kids to school. I've been able to have that joy of being able to say goodbye to each one of them. So I can define things, I can appreciate it in that, and I can, and saying goodbye to each one of them is important to me, because I want them to always know how much I care about them, and to kind of hold that I hold them in my heart, when I say goodbye. So the same situation, but I've got 2 different stories that I can draw on depending on the kind of questions I ask myself.
Yeah, and leaning more into, the trauma-based side of things, what is trauma-informed self-care?
So I suppose I'll step back and kind of maybe talk a little bit about what trauma-informed is, and then I'll talk about it in relation to self-care. And you can feel free to prompt me, because they're kind of 2 concepts that we're kind of bringing together, I guess, when in this podcast and in this conversation. So trauma-informed is a whole kind of research area and practice area that kind of started again in around 2000, but probably had elements before then. But it was really this reaction to research that was kind of showing almost the opposite of what I was talking about before. They call it adverse childhood events. So sometimes people just call them ACEs. So they'd found in the 90s that the prevalence of children having these events was much higher than they thought, for one, and secondly that they had all these impact. So if a child had, 3 or more or 4 or more of these adverse childhood events, their likelihood of, having drug addiction, having mental health problems, having criminal issues, having physical health issues were all significantly higher. And so this brought on, I guess, a little bit of an understanding that we have like cycles of trauma, in the sense that particularly when you experience it as a young child, that trauma can then be kind of almost brought on in different environments over your life course, and you can be re-traumatized. And so the trauma-informed practice was this really call out for systems and for schools and for, prisons and for police officers and for health professionals, all to kind of understand that to be trauma-informed is to not try and re-traumatize, so that to really avoid re-traumatizing. And what I mean by that is, it's probably easiest for me to give a school example, because they're people I've known the most or seen the most. So you've got a kid that comes in and, you know, they're experiencing abuse at home, and maybe you're not 100% aware of that. And that's also part of being trauma informed, is that you maybe start to notice that some of their symptoms or their behaviours come out in ways that you can interpret in different ways. So, for example, they're really dysregulated in class. They're really looking around all the time, and they don't concentrate. And that's actually maybe a symptom of hypervigilance, because they're always on alert. They're always in fight or flight mode because of what's happening at home. Obviously, you're not privy to that as a teacher always, but to be looking out and thinking, what does it mean when they're doing that? Potentially, it could be something to do with home environment. And so instead of potentially re-traumatizing them by punishing them for that behavior and saying, you know, little Jimmy, you're not listening, you're not doing this, go to the principal's office, I'm sick of this. And then them having a major reaction and it escalating, and that being another kind of, I guess it just kind of cementing that trauma story for them, really, that they're not good enough, they're not right, they're not, you know, and it just kind of carries on from there. A trauma-informed approach kind of would say to look at look at trying to understand where that behaviour is coming from, look at trying to search for ways that are going to not re-traumatize. So, and, you know, going from a relationship point of view, going to little Jimmy, okay, I can see, why don't you have some time in the corner to, you know, resettle, trying to help little Jimmy to feel a lot more safer in the classroom, so that he can kind of start to bring down that hypervigilance a little bit. So I guess it's really coming from a point of view of trying to recognize the signs of trauma, trying to realize that there are responses to trauma, and then trying to respond in empathic ways and not re-traumatize. So then if we put that to ourselves, this is where it becomes important, I think, when we think about it in terms of self-care. It's also, and it kind of links back to our conversation before, that when you have a traumatic experience, it's really good to be aware of what trauma symptoms are. And that's like probably the first step, and it's the first step for organizations when they become trauma informed, and that they do a trauma awareness training and that kind of thing. But similarly for individuals, it can be really useful to understand what's going on in the body when we're having a trauma reaction, because when our sense of safety is compromised, we will go into, you know, fight or flight mode. And probably people are quite familiar with that. About, you know, that. But I think sometimes it can be good talking through the kind of brain side of it. And I find I do that a lot with clients, to help them understand that their body's doing what it should be doing. It's trying to protect them at all costs. Like, it's always trying to survive, our bodies. And so when our amygdala, which is like the, you know, ancient subcortical structure in the middle of our brain, kind of goes off, and that's like the alarm center of the brain. Sometimes I call the smoke alarm, because sometimes it does go off like a smoke alarm, and goes off for things that we don't necessarily need it to go off for. And, you know, when the smoke alarm goes off for burnt toast and things, similarly, sometimes we can perceive something that we think that we're at major risk, but we're not necessarily at major risk when we kind of reality check. But so our amygdala will then set off a cascade of things, and our amygdala is connected to our conscious prefrontal kind of cortex as well, which is where that internal voice is really happening. And what tends to happen when we're in a traumatic environment is that all our energy gets put to fight or flight, to survival. So the adrenaline will pump through our bodies, blood will go to our, you know, limbs so that we can, you know, move really quickly. Our muscles will become really tense so we can move really quickly, or we can act, or we can freeze, or everything is about survival. And because of that, some parts can go offline, and that conscious memory can go offline in those moments. And that means that we may not, so, you know, for example, in a kind of, you might have a near-death experience in the car or something like that. All your mind will go to is surviving, and the actual conscious memory of that internal voice can disappear. But our body, and so, sorry, I'm kind of getting tied up, but so because the voice disappears, that means our conscious memory also becomes compromised. So we won't put down that memory of that. This is exactly like when we remember a traumatic event, it won't necessarily all look like a cohesive narrative. It'll be in almost like if you take a mirror and then you smash it, it's all shards of glass, in terms of it kind of, because our conscious memory has been affected, and all our energy resources have gone to our body and our survival, our memories are really affected. But what's hard is that, and this is where, I really recommend books like The Body Keeps the Score by Bert van der Kolk, which, talks about how our body will remember. So our body has the implicit memory of what's happened. So if we go back to the car, then those symptoms of fight or flight will kick in again because our body remembers. But our conscious memory, it's all kind of, jagged glasses, and it's not a cohesive narrative. So a lot of what therapy does is to try and find a cohesive narrative, to find a narrative that makes sense for people.
Yeah, for sure. And like, what kinds of trauma can people find themselves experiencing?
Oh, look, I think, as I said, it's a really broad definition. I suppose when I guess I'm conscious of, I don't want to trigger people, and I think that's why I think, in saying this and saying different examples, I just want to put that caveat in. But, I think abuse examples, when someone is in, being abused in a physical way and in a mental way, in a sexual way, that's an obvious, trauma experience, when they feel, and again, coming back to that safety. So you can have what's called complex and simple. Well, not that simple trauma sounds wrong, because trauma is always not necessarily simple, but complex trauma really refers to that trauma that perhaps happened in childhood that was cumulative over time. So maybe you had an abusive, parents, and that or abusive people in your life, and that continued on for a long period of time and had complex effects. And then you have, an experience of trauma like, 9/11 or something like that, like that you were at the event that was very life-threatening, or a natural disaster or something like that, and felt huge sense of trauma at what's going to happen to me, or you had a one-off car accident or those kind of things. And they both can have, significant effects, and both can, result in PTSD, but both also don't necessarily result in PTSD, which is also important to keep in mind.
Yeah. And when we're talking about self-care, is there like a different approach that people take when they approach different types of trauma?
Yeah, look, I think what it comes back to is emphasizing what works for you in self-care. And I think the first part of the self-care part would be being aware of your own symptoms, I think and that's why the knowledge piece is really important. So we become aware of our fight or flight. And so, because if you're not aware of that, then that's where it can creep up on you. It's that kind of, you go to a place and you're not aware that you're feeling those, you're starting to get a feel of fight or flight, and you're not aware why this is happening. And then, of course, that's going to create more anxiety for you because you're confused. When you're confused, then you become more anxious. And so learning to understand the symptoms is really important in the first kind of step of self-care. And then I think secondly, within self-care is a really interesting area, because I think people kind of often focus on, take a bath, go and get your nails done, do things. And I think those are all really important and good for self-care. But I think it's really about finding what's going to work for you in that moment, I think, as well. Like, so that's why I'm not a big fan of doing long, big self-care plans, because that can be sometimes a popular thing to do of, saying I'm going to run every day and I'm going to do this every day. Some days you're going to wake up and you're not going to want to run. Sometimes you're going to wake up and, the best thing you can do is tune into your emotions and see what you're really asking yourself, what you really need that day to get through. And then taking an experimental kind of flexible approach. Yeah, that, maybe you watch a movie and it doesn't work. And so you think, okay, what have I learned about this and what can I do differently, or what can I do now? So always kind of remembering that there's always different options, but to kind of evaluate them as you go, and recognize that each day is going to be different.
Yeah, and I've had experiences with like self-care types of things where I'll try something and then it doesn't work and it kind of makes me feel bad because it didn't work, and I'm kind of just disappointed because I tried this and I'm like, oh, it didn't work. Like, why isn't it working? So my next question for you is, how can people like cope with that if they're trying new things to get better with their self-care, but, they're going through a series of, things where it's just not working out for them? How can they go through that?
I think, like you said, it's important to normalize it, that the first understanding is to know that not everything's like, just because it works for, your friend or works for someone else doesn't mean it's going to work for you on this day today. And it's all about tuning in on what does work for you. And I think having that idea that, I guess, when you think about hope is this idea that you have lots of different pathways to get to a place. So when they've conceptualized hope in the research and things, they talk about having lots of different pathways. So understanding that there's lots of different ways to care for yourself, and to not judge yourself because you're not kind of doing it right. And then I guess it kind of comes down to, within that judgment side of it, I think it comes down to self-compassion as well, which is a really important part of all of this. And that self-compassion is, came about, I guess, through the researcher Kristen Neff, who's really popularized the term. And it's really talking about mindfulness, like I've been really referring to, which is that, consciousness of our emotions and inner thoughts and kind of knowing where we're at. So that's one component. The second component is this idea of connecting to common humanity and understanding that we all struggle and we're all in it together. And then the third one is kindness, which is being kind to ourselves. And I think in the example that you give about, you might, I think you gave a specific example, but you might try a self-care practice, and let's say it is, having a bath, and you sit in the bath and you think, is it doing anything for me? And I'm failing at self-care, and nothing seems to work. And kind of thinking, like, would you judge, like, if your friend was sitting in the bath and saying I'm not liking baths, would you say, oh, it's not going to work? You'd probably say, like, oh, well, why don't we try something else? And it's just not for you. That's okay. So it's really applying that lens of how can we be kind to ourselves? How can we be kind in even our self-care plans, that we're not trying to judge ourselves. We're always trying to kind of think, and I think that's a good kind of question to ask ourselves at times, what would a friend say to us about this? How would they react? Or how would you react to a friend? So if they were having the same struggle, what would you say? And that's a question I often put to people in therapy, and they go, because they first tell me the judgmental story. I didn't do my running. I said I was going to do my running, and I've really failed at that, and I'm not doing well, and everything seems terrible. And then I might, eventually ask the question of, well, what would you say to a friend who didn't do their running, and they usually say, "Oh, no," I'd say, "That's okay. You just try again tomorrow."
Yeah.
There's a lot more compassionate responses to other people. We often save that for others and don't give it to ourselves in the same way.
Yeah, for sure. And what are some like trauma-informed self-care practices that listeners can maybe implement in their daily lives?
So I think trauma, coming back to that idea of trauma kind of affects the body as well. There's lots of different approaches that you can, I think that, and that's what's really important to be aware of what works for you. But there's body type approaches. So there's lots of, and I guess it's still growing as an area, but trauma-informed yoga or just yoga by itself, it doesn't necessarily have to be trauma-informed, but things like mindfulness practices can help with that. Again, grounding and being able to kind of connect with ourselves and reality, and the present moment, because when we are experiencing those symptoms, we tend to kind of get stuck in the past or stuck in the future, worrying about what is this always going to be, or trying to kind of make sense of the past. And there's a space for making sense of the past, as I said before, around finding narratives, and I might talk a little bit about that as a thing, but mindfulness is also really a good one for that conscious awareness of what's going on in our bodies, and helps with that, particularly the symptom of dissociation. So that's a common trauma symptom where we feel dissociated from our bodies, or we feel disconnected from reality. And again, that's to do with that conscious awareness kind of going offline. So mindfulness practices, yoga, things like that can really help with that. But it's not going to work for everyone, as I said before. And then it comes, I guess, another one is to understand is having that cohesive narrative and the importance of narrative. And one of the things I focus a lot on with trauma with clients is getting the story of their survival and writing down the story of their survival. Because, as I said at the very beginning of the podcast, I guess, or the conversation, was that problems can be overwhelming, and we can kind of get stuck in all the effects. And the effects are really important to talk about. All the effect that the traumatic experience has had on us, what it's done to us, how it's changed us. That's all important. But there's also our responses, and there's always responses that we can draw out. So it might be that even though you froze in that moment when the car, when you're in the car and you had a car accident, that freezing was your body trying to keep safe, and that was a way that, even though it doesn't feel like a response, it was a response. It was trying to stop yourself from doing any more harm. So it's really trying to work out, I guess, mine those kind of stories of how we survived, how we responded, what we did to learn from it, not learn from it, but what we did, or how we can learn from it, what we can take from it. There's a whole area called post-traumatic growth.
Okay.
And that's in the kind of positive psychology, I guess, field. And it really talks about the idea that trauma can be an opportunity for understanding growth. And often I think when you hear people, like when people often share their trauma stories, and they, if it like big, I guess, what am I thinking of, like celebrities or people that have gone through significant adversity, often that's one of the themes that you hear. That, if I think of like Michael J. Fox, for example, he's written quite a few books about his diagnosis with Parkinson's, and he talks about how even though Parkinson's has been awful, and I can imagine that he wouldn't want it on anyone, he still looks at it and goes, it actually made my life better in some ways, because it connected me to the people around me more. It made me appreciate my relationships more. And the trajectory I was on before that, which was probably more fame and, that kind of thing, wasn't really heading that way. And now look at the impact his life has had. He's set up these foundations. He's set up, on Parkinson's. He's raised awareness. He's had such a meaningful impact. So, and I think it's important, though, in these conversations, not trying to put a silver lining on trauma, because it's not something that, it's not like trying to Pollyanna it and make the most out of it. I think it's trying to make a story that makes sense for you, that's useful to you, that helps you understand that you have survived, that regardless of what's happened, you are still here. Like, yes, you felt a strong sense of not being safe and often moral violations and things like that, but you have survived and you are here. So let's look at what's helped you to survive.
Yeah, for sure. And are there any other potential challenges or barriers of practicing self-care that people should be aware of and know not to be too hard on themselves about?
Yeah, I think one of the hard things is sometimes recognizing when you do need the help. So sometimes we can struggle on our own for too long. But I think sometimes it's better to reach out early and get the support in the early stage, as opposed to kind of falling in a heap and then getting it later. Not that I'm judging either one. It's just that sometimes it's harder to kind of rewind and come back in that way, that it's much easier to get it early. So sometimes just knowing when you need help, when you need to kind of have someone guiding you through this process, because all the things that I'm talking about, some of them really you do need a therapist for to really help guide you along that path. And it may not be a therapist; it might be a priest, it might be a really good friend. Because I think it's not saying that it has to be a therapist, but sometimes you got to recognize that resilience happens in context. That everything about your community, everything about that, all impacts how well you recover.
Yeah, for sure. And are there some sort of self-care practices that can be triggering for trauma survivors, or anything that people should avoid?
Yeah, I think anything can be triggering, unfortunately. And so it is about being potentially planning for those moments, or where you can, and you might not know what's triggering, and that's the hard part.
Yeah.
But maybe if you are trying something new, then have a bit of a plan for if it's something that's maybe a little bit, new and a little bit more you're a bit nervous about. For example, you might be going for your first massage, because that's a self-care practice. But then you go to do the massage and it triggers a whole bunch of things. That touch triggers a whole bunch of things.
Yeah.
So I think in those instances, trying to listen to your gut instinct and kind of understanding, okay, if I'm trying something new, like a massage or yoga class, or I'm going to a new course on, trauma awareness training or something like that, then it's important to be kind of going, having a couple of plans in place, like, okay, I'm going to meet my friend straight afterwards, or I'm going to tell the instructor that I may not do the whole class, and if I leave, please don't follow me, I'll be okay, or do follow me if you want them to, so I guess having a bit of, preempting, because as I said, it's hard. Like, there are going to be things that are going to be harder for people in terms of that triggering, and it really depends on the trauma that you've experienced, and it depends on a whole bunch of factors in that way. And it's sometimes hard to, for example, a song might come on the radio that you haven't heard for 60 years, or not 60 years, sorry. It might be 60 years, but it might be, you haven't heard it for a long time, and then suddenly that brings back all these memories.
Yeah.
And it's in the yoga, it's in the gym that you go into for your self-care practice, and suddenly you have to go. And so I guess it's having management plans in place of what you're going to do when those kind of situations arise.
Yeah, and you mentioned trauma awareness training before. So on the lines of that, are there any other like tools that people can use to help them get through this?
In terms of awareness training, or
In terms of like, self-care, or are there any sort of like resources they can use?
so there is some really good organisations who do trauma awareness training. So there's Blue Knot in Australia, and so I'm really kind of a little bit more focused on Australia, but
Yeah.
and I understand that there might be an international audience, but the good thing about them is that they're on the web. So if you're in Canada or if you're wherever you are, you could still access it, and they've got fact sheets and that kind of thing. So Blue Knot is really good. It's got some really good information about all the things I've been talking about memory and that kind of thing. As I said, Bert Van der Kolk, his book, The Body Keeps the Score, is kind of a little bit one of the Bibles in this area of trauma awareness, and understanding the impact of trauma and understanding the body's reaction to trauma. Dan Siegel also has some really great books on this, and really easy to read books as well. He's a really great communicator. Phoenix Institute is another one in Australia who focus on probably more PTSD. So I guess more kind of clinical end, but has some really great resources as well.
Yeah, awesome. And in terms of like navigating all of these resources, because I feel like sometimes it can be overwhelming because there's so much out there. Like you can get advice from people, you can go online and just be flooded with all these websites. How can someone navigate all of this? And is there like a first point of call?
Look, not that I'm really aware of in terms of like trauma, like phone lines and that kind of stuff, or first port of call. But I suppose what I'd say is, depending on how significant it's impacting your life, it's really important to be able to get therapeutic support. And in Australia, that usually starts with going to your GP and talking to them about some of the symptoms that you're experiencing and getting a mental health care plan, so that you can then be referred on to a psychologist or a social worker, and get some counselling through that. There's often also in Australia, and I guess I'm just talking in the local context, there's often what they call like sexual assault centres, or particular centres that look at different traumas. So it's often not always in the one area. So for example, if, I'm thinking of Victoria, where I am in Australia, there's a place called Foundation House, and they are the experts in trauma for more refugee experiences and asylum seekers. So it really kind of depends on your experience. But I suppose having someone that you can talk to, going back to before, it doesn't have to be a therapist. A therapist can be a good checking base, but it might be just having someone like a good friend that you can meet with regularly and have a chat to about how you're going to navigate it all. But because there is a lot of information, and you don't have to read it all. It's just finding what's useful.
Yeah, beautiful. I think we can jump into our next section now, which is our practices debrief. So here I'm just going to ask you about some everyday kind of applications that you have, or anything you can share with us. So is there like a practice that you could recommend to help cultivate, self-awareness of trauma?
I think mindfulness practices
Yeah.
are really a great start. And I think having that just simple mindfulness as well. So sometimes I think mindfulness can also kind of become one of those self-care chores rather than self-care love kind of things that people kind of think I should be doing 10. So trying not to have too many goals around it, but just trying to do it as much as you can. Maybe building in a bit of a routine, having maybe 5 minutes in the morning where you just close your eyes and, focus on your breathing as best you can. Just being patient with yourself. Remember being non-judgmental and to just allow yourself to breathe in that time, and having a bit of an anchor for across the day, because that's kind of what I talk a lot about with mindfulness, that the breath is an anchor that you can always come back to, and you've got some control over it, so you can kind of slow it down when you need to slow it down, and gives you a good ground. It's a good grounding technique. And I guess that's the thing. It may not work for you sitting there and focusing on your breath all day, but maybe it's a minute where you just take 3 breaths and just make them conscious breaths. So finding that practice that's going to work for you. Sometimes people's kind of mindfulness is like going for a run, where they're kind of just in the present moment, and they're just, focused on the run itself. So that's still a mindfulness practice. So it's really being flexible about what we consider mindfulness to be, but trying to find those times where you are present in the moment, and because it's a bit of a brain training exercise. It's the more we can kind of practice that, the more we can use that when we are in times of stress, where our mind has traveled somewhere that we don't want it to go. The more practiced that we are at being able to bring our attention back to what we do want to attend to, which may be the present moment, the easier it will be.
Sure. And is this something that you practice in your life as well?
Yeah, look, I think I think that's why I always say have a very flexible approach, because I'm really busy. It's hard to carve out even 5 minutes sometimes to sit there and do a mindfulness practice. So sometimes I will just, have those moments where I'll just stop and attend to my breathing for a couple of minutes. I won't necessarily always sit and do a mindfulness practice, but one of the things I guess I'm lucky in is that I do mindfulness with my clients. And so I often lead a mindfulness, and that can help me, I guess, tune into mindful awareness. And I often before sessions, I tend to try and have, as I said, maybe 2 minutes, maybe 3 minutes, I close my eyes just before I greet a person. And that's just a way of me, almost as well as like an honor to that person. Like I want to be present for them. I don't want my, busy life to kind of impact that relationship. I want to be with them, and particularly because I work with kids and adolescents, I want them to know I'm 100% there.
Yeah, I feel like that's such a beautiful approach as well. And mindfulness is something that I've been trying to practice in my life too. But like you said, it's something that really takes a lot of practice to do. And going back to what we were talking about not like being too hard on yourself when you do try these self-care things. Sometimes I feel like if you want to get better at something, it's just about like persevering and pushing through it.
100%. Like it's just about kind of like, I think, the research by Kristen Neff looked at like our motivation, and she's the the self-compassion researcher, and she did like some really kind of cool studies on motivation, and how when we kind of often we have this perception that we motivate ourselves by kind of the stick. We say like, if you don't do this, you're going to get in trouble. If you don't do that, you're going to, if you don't do mindfulness, then you're going to have mental health problems, or that kind of thing. And that really isn't motivating. It's not as motivating as being kind to ourselves, which sometimes feels like, oh, you're just being too soft on yourself. But if you're kind of saying to yourself, forgiving yourself and saying, I didn't do mindfulness today, I'll try it tomorrow. You have a much more better relationship with mindfulness almost. You're like, okay, me and mindfulness can get along. We'll try again tomorrow, Whereas if you kind of like, kind of beating yourself up every time you don't do it, then you start thinking, oh, maybe I don't want to do mindfulness then, because it becomes like something that you beat yourself up about.
Yeah. And I feel like with these types of practices, it's so important to just be forgiving with yourself as well. So I'm so glad you mentioned that, because I feel like it's so easy to just like keep berating ourselves for being so bad at something, when really we're just doing the best we can do.
100%. Yeah. I think if forgiveness is all part of it. That again, like you wouldn't like berate a friend who didn't have a coffee every day. Like if their self-care plan was to have a coffee and a mindfulness session every day and they didn't do it, you wouldn't say, oh, not good enough, you're a failure. You'd say, oh, you didn't do it one day, that's okay, you put it in perspective, you can try again. You'd give all those encouragements. So I think it's like remembering to apply the same thinking to ourselves.
So we can just get straight into our open mic section now. So the floor is yours if you'd like to talk about anything at all. It could be to do with this topic or could be totally random.
Oh, great. I think I'd like to emphasize that trauma and experiences of trauma are often abnormal, as in the things that are not going to happen on your day-to-day life, but we often have what's a normal response to it. So when we are feeling, these symptoms that I've been talking about, the fight or flight symptoms or flashbacks or those kind of things, that's a pretty normal response to an abnormal event. And that's something that I've kind of talked a lot about with clients, that these are this is an abnormal thing that's happened, but what your response is normal, that you're not broken because of this, that instead of focusing on what's wrong with you, we focus on what's happened to you and what we can now do about it. I think that also ties into probably another area that I'm really interested in and I do a little bit of research in at the moment, which is the idea of shame and how shame relates to trauma and how we can fall into spirals of shame very easily, because shame is really this very strong, I guess, emotion, or strong negative emotion that really is this judgment of ourselves in relation to other people. So we kind of see us as some sort of not good enough or not right, and we see other people thinking about us in this way. And it may not even be other people. Maybe we think a God thinks of us in this way. It's just, I guess, a sense of the other thinking that there's something wrong with us. And shame is as I said, it can be a really strong emotion, and it kind of can really taint everything else. And I think it's really important to be aware of shame as an emotion, because that's where, when we think about trauma responses in different ways, and when we're going back to those ACE studies of the adverse childhood events, some people look to they feel a sense of shame and they look to kind of fix that shame by drinking a lot or by taking drugs and alcohol. So they try and get rid of that shame, or they get rid of the shame by being aggressive. So by getting the respect that they want by being aggressive to another person. So we often as human beings hate shame. No one likes to feel that there's something wrong with us. Yeah. But in response to that, we can sometimes have these really unhelpful behaviors and ways of coping with it. And so recognizing that shame is an emotion for one, and recognizing that, and that's where I guess it ties back into mindfulness, is that all emotions are temporary, that we're not going to be stuck in it forever, that it is an experience. Like, we might feel that in that moment, but it doesn't have to define us. And not trying to also completely squash it down, get rid of it. Because if we do that, then that's when we kind of try and ignore it, and that kind of thing, rather than just kind of allow it to pass. And I'm not saying step into it and believe it. I'm saying allow it to pass. I think that they're two different things. So stepping into shame is kind of saying, yes, that story is correct. I'm a failure. I'm this. I'm not good enough. But understanding shame as a passing emotion is saying, oh, I'm getting the story that I'm not good enough. Taking a step back and watching that and going, okay, I'm kind of stepping into shame here. And an understanding that you can step out of it. You don't have to be taken down into this shame spiral, because once you're in that spiral, that's when you kind of, it can be really hard to get yourself out of. And that's when I think a lot more you kind of fall into a lot of mental health issues around that.
Yeah, for sure. And just on like the topic of shame and I guess where it stems from, would you say that like cultural background and cultural factors contribute towards this?
Yeah, I think there's quite a bit of research around, I guess, how different cultures experience shame differently as well. That, so that kind of losing faith culture of, how if someone's reputation gets damaged in some way, how cultures sometimes value that more or less. And I also think shame obviously affects culture, but it also affects environment. So that's where I'm kind of interested in with schools and places like that, where shame can kind of become normal. Like we accidentally shame kids sometimes by the practices that we do, by saying certain things, like, or by, putting their name on a board or something like that. That's a really shaming kind of thing, that, when they're naughty and you put their name on the board and you say, that's you, Jimmy. I'm pointing out to the whole class that there's something wrong with you. That can be quite shaming. And then
Yeah.
I guess that ties back into being trauma aware and also shame sensitive, which is kind of a newer area, shame sensitivity, but it's a developing area in the research field at the moment.
Yeah, for sure. And I guess sort of developing awareness that you are like traumatized is hard. So, how can someone, I guess, go about developing greater awareness for that?
Mm-hmm. Uh, so I guess in terms of finding more information about trauma or trauma about whether they have been affected by trauma.
Yeah, so whether that be like resources or even like being comfortable with reaching out to loved ones or someone to talk to.
Mm. I think it's a process. Help seeking is different for different people, and it's another area that's always been of interest to me, exploring that. But I think gender and culture also kind of play a part in that sometimes. That sometimes when I've talked to men about help seeking, and they've said to me, I wouldn't call up a friend and say I need help, but I might call up a friend and say I want to go for a bike ride or I want to do something, and then it might come out in that way. Or they might not even talk specifically to their friend about it. They just need a friend at that time. And I think it's okay to have different ways of reaching out for help, and often, those. I think it's just being open to maybe talking about it with someone at some point. But even in saying that, some people don't respond in that way to help, to talking through a trauma. Some, like, that's what they've kind of, the research has found quite a lot, that back, in maybe the 90s, we all thought that people needed to debrief trauma, and actually it was actually having a worse effect. Everyone was sitting debriefing and it wasn't actually working. So it's finding what works for you again, as opposed to saying that this is how you should do it. But I think building self-awareness, the main practical things that you can do are, one, talking to people, two, reading or writing about it, is really important, because it's all about kind of getting a bit of making it make sense for you. So I think either one of those things are really good to find your. It comes back down to that same theme of getting a cohesive story, of making it make sense for you. Because when things don't make sense, humans don't like that. We don't like things that don't make sense, and it continues to play on our mind a lot. So it's finding what makes sense for you, and whether, if that is going to a yoga class once a week or going to a boxing class once a week, and never really talking that much about it, then that's okay. It has to work with what works for you.
Yeah, beautiful. And I think that's also the perfect way to leave today's episode. So thank you so much for joining us today, Georgie.
Oh, thank you for having me on. It's been a real pleasure to just kind of, talk about an area of passion like this and have an opportunity to really, tease out some of the things around trauma and self-care. So I really appreciate it. So thanks, Joanna.
No, it's my pleasure. I 100% agree, though. I feel like it's such a nuanced topic, and we also don't just have these types of conversations in like everyday life. So I think it's so important to bring about more awareness that there are people who are going through, trauma, and, self-care is important in that process. So I'm glad we were able to talk about that today.
Good. Thank you.
Perfect. And for those of us who want to find out more about you, where can we go?
So I've got a small private practice called Storykind Psychology. So you can go and have a look on there. I just run a really small private practice. As I said, I kind of work across research and supervision and private practice. But that website probably gives you a little bit more information about me and who I am, my LinkedIn profile. Yeah, that's probably it.
Awesome. Well, we also have Georgie's details in the description below. But to everyone listening, don't forget to like and subscribe, and we'll see you guys next time.
Thanks.
You have been listening to Bouncing Back, the Personal Resilience Science Insights podcast produced by the Life Management Science Labs. Listen to episodes from LMSL's 10 Life Management Perspectives on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, or other podcasting apps on your smartphone. If you enjoyed this episode, please consider rating our show, sharing it, and subscribing to our channel, as it helps other people find it and us grow to bring you more quality resources. More of our work can be found on our website, pr.lmsl.net, where you can join our movement. I'm Joanna. Thanks for tuning in.